What stands out to you as uniquely different in the current shift with AI?
Oh my gosh, the current shift with AI with regards to transformation is really profound.
Alexa, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm so honored to be spending the time with you and get your insights. Maybe you could share with us a little bit about your wonderful journey that you've had and your experiences.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I am excited about the conversation today. My name is Alexis Fink, and I've spent the last 30 years working on organization transformation, typically in an HR context, but I really concern myself with questions of work, working, and workers. Most recently, I have entered my post-corporate season following a stint as Vice President of People Analytics and Workforce Strategy at Meta, and previously I held similar roles at Intel and at Microsoft.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. So, my first big question to you is you have seen so much and you've, really driven multiple waves of transformation. What stands out to you as uniquely different in the current shift with AI?
Oh my gosh, the current shift with AI with regards to transformation is really profound. Typically, when you hear organizations talk about transformation, they're doing kind of a strategy shift. They may be moving into a new market or shifting from one type of product to another. And that is a material transformation. What you're seeing now with AI, though, is the way work is able to be accomplished has really changed in a profound way. And this means that there are all kinds of things that were never possible before that are now possible. I was telling a friend just yesterday that a nice analog is I worked for a while for BASF. One of their lines of business is automotive coatings. And when robotics came in, you were able to go from like a single guy with a paint sprayer to dunking the entire auto body into a vat of paint. And it was much higher quality. It was an awful lot faster. There was so much less waste. And it's that kind of fundamentally different way of solving the same problem that we're now going to be able to do with AI.
Oh, that's great.
That takes you to one of the places that people are making mistakes because all they're doing is speeding up their current process instead of really taking advantage of the moment to think about it differently.
So that leads me to another thought, which is there's so much investment in AI right now
Yeah.
and a lot of data to track it, but organizations often are misreading the signals when it comes to adoption. So what is not working and what needs to change? And from your perspective, how do we do that?
Boy, adoption is obviously going to be an interesting metric as part of your suite of metrics, but it is far from the end game. Adoption isn't really the point. Business impact is really the point. And so if you have everyone using it, but they're using it to schedule their meetings more efficiently, that's not going to change the way you do business. So rather than thinking about adoption as your sort of be all and all metric, and I'm really surprised by the number of organizations that that's what they talk about, really think about what is the business impact you're trying to achieve. And then think about how you are doing that from a health standpoint, right? What is the health of your models? Because they're not fixed entities. The context changes, what's coming in changes, the context around them changes. So you need to make sure that you are, I talk about treating them like a garden where you're constantly tending and pruding and weeding and planting and moving. Like you need to tend these like a garden on a daily basis.
I love
Um,
I love that
yeah,
analogy of a
yeah,
garden. And
yeah.
I think that tying adoption to business impact, at the end of the day, tools are tools. What do we
Right.
want those tools to help us do? Have better bottom line impact on
That's
our
right.
organizations, be more innovative, meet the market where it's going, and have positive bottom line results for the organization so it continues to grow and prosper. So that insight to me is super powerful, Alexis. This notion of adoption to impact as opposed to adoption as the end game.
Well, and I think people are working backwards in a lot of ways that are deceptive. So, again, literally just yesterday, I was having a conversation with someone who's really excited about their new AI coaching bot. right? That it's freeing up time from the HRBPs. By the way, individual HRBPs are building these coaching bots. That's a different strategic question. They're like, wow, it's being used. Let's pretend 10 hours a week. And they're saying this is 10 hours a week of HRBP time we're saving. And the problem is it's not. It might be 1 hour a week of HRBP time that would formerly have been dedicated to that task. So what they've done is elevated the conversation and the capability. They've elevated the capacity of the system overall, but they have not removed 10 hours a week of time from that one HRBP. So they can't go around and say, great, I can cut 10% of my HRBPs because of this. So it's
Mm,
fundamentally different work that's happening in different places. And if you're
yeah.
not thinking about how you're measuring the whole system, then you can really make some ill-advised decisions based on that imperfect analysis.
Yeah, now that brings up another thought to me, which is, how is AI changing the way organizations understand and manage their people? Because at the end of the day, what are organizations
Yeah.
other than the people that drive the results?
Yeah. It's interesting. There are two very different schools of thought about this that I'm seeing kind of stabilize. One of them is very, very micro. And so you've seen for a while, like in your Amazon warehouses, et cetera, you're seeing some in the press now of some larger organizations that are really going micro and looking at everything a person does. What are your keystrokes? What are your mouse movements? Where are you? How long were you in the bathroom? Right? Very, very, very high levels of surveillance. The bright side of that is we're trying to figure out how to automate. You may have heard stories of like UPS telling drivers exactly how to enter the truck to minimize their workman's comp injuries, for example. Like we're going to reduce steps, we're going to reduce repetitive stress injuries. So there's a bright side to that. There's a dark side to that where you're training a model to replace yourself. So that micro strategy is one that we see. The other that I'm seeing less evidence of, but I'm more excited about, is one that's more about the impact of the outcome. And so when you think about performance management, it's often kind of micro, but there are some systems that just say, what's the outcome that you did? And so now, how do you compare someone who's using a bunch of coding agents that have now 10x or 100x what their capability is? Are you counting their output, or are you looking at some other kind of a metric that talks about the outcomes of the work writ large? So, talk about stability, quality, impact, revenue, these other kinds of outcome measures. And so, it's interesting to see some organizations starting to think more in those more macro kinds of outcomes as they're trying to evaluate their work. And the reality is it'll probably be a combination for most use cases and most organizations, but I get really anxious when I see ones really trying to atomize things as their only strategy.
So what's super interesting about that, Alexis, is this notion of business impact and outcome. And I spoke to a senior executive at a Fortune 10 company, financial services firm, just last week. And they were measuring people's, adopting AI by keystroke and
Yeah.
kind of equating that with productivity. But I do
Mm,
think that it means that we have to think differently about how we are evaluating people. And I love your notion of outcomes. And,
yeah.
thinking differently. And one outcome could be, one team performs much better than another team because
Yeah.
they're using the tools and they're collaborating more effectively and leveraging themselves uh, more quickly or in a more creative way. And so we
Yeah.
have to think differently about how we're measuring outcomes. So that grabs another thought, which is all about as we think about integrating AI to get work done, what have you seen that actually works? And those companies that are doing it right, what are they doing right? And what can others learn from them as we all are going through this transformation process?
Ah, I love that question because everybody got quite spun up about the MIT study last fall that said most pilots aren't scaling. There were methodological problems in that study. But in the meantime, quite recently, Stanford came out with a really solid study. It's 116 pages, it's very thorough, of 50 some organizations that had really thoughtfully and effectively implemented AI. And so there are some things that we do see people doing really thoughtfully that comes out of that study. I would encourage people to read it. They identified 11 key insights. And a lot of those centered on the idea that you just raised around AI being a tool. In fact, one of their insights was it kind of doesn't matter which tool you use. It's much more about where in the business process you put it and what you're asking it to do. They found much bigger impact, as you might imagine, when you've got something that's relatively low complexity, relatively low risk, and you can sort of set the AI loose and say, just do this. And I'm only going to worry about the edge cases and I'm going to worry about some quality management, right? Think about old school statistical process control, as opposed to much lower impact from things where it's an augmentation strategy and you still have to be heavily involved. You simply can't gain that much more efficiency when you're being gated by the human capacity. There were some other things, though, that I think are really important. Sure, it was about business design. Sure, it's about strategic choice, but it was also about things that I loosely call organizational culture and the role of leaders and sponsors. And so when leaders and sponsors are sitting there wagging their finger at you and saying, you'd better do it, it doesn't necessarily happen. In fact, sometimes you get people operating out of fear or other kinds of things. What they found was when the leaders were really actively involved, and by actively involved, I mean removing blockers, like actively involved in the implementation, then you tended to get better results. And so instead of just standing on high and saying, boy, everybody better do this, getting down into the process and saying, what tripped you up? What wasn't working? How can I use my authority or the vantage point that I have or the budget I have access to, whatever I have as a leader in my bag of tricks, how can I use that to get you unblocked?
I
And that
really
role
like
really,
that.
really mattered.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
really, really like that. I do think that in any initiative, in any organization, big or small, having those sponsors and that culture of
Yeah.
openness and willingness to sort of how do we get to yes? We might have to change how we're thinking in order to get there. And having leaders own it makes a huge difference in the success of the initiative,
Yep.
no matter what it is. And Alexis, I love that Stanford report that you mentioned. Could you share the title of it so for our listeners, people could go and grab it, which I will do as well after we finish?
Excellent. It is a great report. It's out of the Stanford Digital Economy Lab, and it's called the AI Playbook. It's about 116 pages. They go through different kinds of industries, and they really go into detail about what made the project successful. It's quite a wonderful resource.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
Uh, Another thought was we talk a lot about adaptability, especially in the age of AI, but it's so hard to measure. How do you measure adaptability? And then, you know, how does an organization know if people are adapting, if people are, leveraging these tools in ways that actually can, further the outcomes and the impact?
That's such a great question because you always want a firm answer, right? You always want to know this is how you measure it and this is the correct level. And the challenge is that while there are personal attributes and skills and practices that contribute to this, right? The ability to gather information, the ability to test it against your current information, and the ability to use good judgment in knowing when to make a change and when to stay the course. Those are skills, capabilities, they are measurable. I've built like leadership competency systems that specifically tested for that. But one of the challenges is often you can only know in the past tense whether they made the right call. And there is a balance and a judgment point between deciding, I have this new piece of information and I'm going to use it to change course versus I have this new piece of information and being able to make progress is more valuable than shifting gears again because then sometimes you never really make any progress. You're just being bandied about and whipsawed all the time.
Well, I do think that it's interesting because it's like the GPS systems that we use,
Yeah.
Yesterday, I met a friend and we took a walk and then we picked a restaurant to meet at. And we both put our GPSs in and we both had our individual cars. And I started going in one direction and I saw her turn right around and go the other direction. And then I called her and said, I don't think you're going in the right direction. And she goes, but that's what my GPS says. And so, I think we're used to if the technology tells us it must know that it's right, we must follow it. And I think with AI, and I've been reading a lot about this, sometimes it gives you exactly what you want to hear to make you feel
Hmm.
better, but it may not be like the right answer. The answer may be, moving towards the middle of what all the data says, but not necessarily how it could help you win in the market. So I think there's this level of like, do we take everything at face value because it's coming from a technology tool that we think is better than us, smarter than us? And in fact, it might be, but then where are we to oversee that? So, thoughts about that?
Yeah, I actually have two thoughts. And the first is through most of life, through most of education, and sort of our certainty seeking minds, we are trained around systems that are complicated, but they have a correct answer, and that correct answer is findable. It's like I have a kid who's really into cars, and so we've dropped engines into a couple of old non-working cars. And if you hook everything up the right way and the electronics and the electrical systems and the hoses and the everything is right, you turn the key and the car fires. It works, right? That's very exciting. And there is a knowable, discoverable answer that is achievable. The problem is a lot of the things and the questions we're trying to ask, particularly a lot of business and strategy questions, aren't complicated. They're complex. They're like weather. There's not one answer. They're dynamic, and the only way you can judge is in the rearview mirror. And you can make a choice that is good or bad based on the available information. But right or wrong is only determinable when everything else has happened and you've got results you can evaluate. And I think people
Mm.
get really tangled with that because they expect to be able to evaluate right and wrong. And really, all they can evaluate is good and bad. The other thought I have is an exercise that I hope everyone has tried and tries regularly. When I'm really working on something, I will generally take the exact same prompt and I'll dump it into at least three engines and see what comes out. And I'll frequently take the same engine and then redump it, or the same prompt and redump it into the same engines. So I may ask the exact same question 6 times, or I recently did it about a dozen times as you're trying to iterate your way and see what different little turns they make. And the LLMs in particular, which is what most people mean when they refer to AI, right? They're talking about the large language models. They are probabilistic by design. They have some randomness by design, and that's how they seem natural. That's how they help you go down different little nooks and crannies. But if you're trying to do something like an audit, something where there is a right answer and you have to be able to prove it or discover it, you need a different kind of technology. You shouldn't be dumping that into an LLM.
Super interesting. And by the way, that kind of touches on something about productivity and saving time,
Mhm.
where if you're actually taking the same prompt and dumping it into 3 to 5 different LLMs, it might not be time you're saving, but you are having almost like a thought partner, somebody sitting
Mhm.
on your shoulder that's a strategist helping you think through things, and it helps you be more thoughtful and have more impact because you're actually seeing different angles that you might not otherwise see. But that
Yeah,
doesn't mean that you're saving time. And I
that's
think
right.
that that initial use of AI can be perceived as, oh my God, this will do my work for me. But if you're really a critical thinker and wanting to have that impact, you have to assess, evaluate, and strategically look at different angles from different approaches. And so that might not necessarily limit your time or reduce your time.
Yeah, it really depends on the use case, right? If you are processing customer requests, you may be able to really scale the heck out of that thing, right? You'd want to use a deterministic engine, not a probabilistic engine, because if I order a size medium in white, I would like a size medium in white to show up, right? I don't want to be like, well, I think maybe you would have liked purple and an extra large. That's not how this should go. On the other hand, if you are genuinely using it as a thought partner, as a creative partner, as a strategic partner, then what you're doing is less about capacity and more about often and more about quality, more about how can I do something better than I would have done before.
Yeah, I love capacity versus quality. You are incredibly insightful, and I'm so glad to be spending this time together with you. One last thought from my end, which is, leaders are trying to balance data and the tools and the human side of change.
Yeah.
People are saying, where are the people in the mix, and can we bring them along? What's one mind shift that you think is critical right now?
Oh, I think the mind shift that's critical right now is Marshall Goldsmith likes to say that what got you here won't get you there. So all of the things that you have learned that have made you effective are open to re-examination. And so I think the people who will be most effective are the ones who hold their ideas most loosely. Like, here is what I want. Here is how I want to do it. And I am very open to being wrong. And I think those folks who are open to being wrong and can let go of their ego about that, I think that those are the ones who are really going to win. And that's how
Those are the ones that are
scientists are
going to
trained.
really win. And I kind
Yeah,
of dub that as curiosity, like this
totally.
ongoing curiosity and not being beholden to what worked there won't work
That's
here. And
right.
by the way, I was lucky enough to be in a world with Marshall Goldsmith
Oh,
on a Sunday in New York a couple of years ago as he was launching some new thinking and practices. So he is
nice. He's
an
marvelous.
amazing, amazing person,
Yeah,
a leader in this HR space. Um, well, I've really enjoyed our time together.
me
Is,
too.
is there anything else that you would like to share? I feel like you have so much to offer and you've seen so much in the world of transformation in your career.
I think one of the things that I would love to offer is that although I just said you need to be open to changing your mind and letting go of the things you've learned that have worked well in the past, that doesn't mean you should throw out everything you've learned in the past. And there's some really classic stuff about managing through change that's still important. So all of the like classic Cotter stuff is still really important. Really engaging with the people who do the work and know what's required is still really important as you think about transformation. It becomes important also to help them get out of their own silo and look across at fundamentally different ways we could achieve that end. But knowing and discovering all those little pieces of human glue that maybe aren't widely known becomes really important to not having pilots fail when you move them out of pilot phase to scale, for example.
Excellent, excellent.